going to talk about inner joins, and in this case, inner join is an intersection between two tables. So if you have a table called city and a table called customer, the inner join would be an intersection between the two tables, city and customer. Excuse the typo there. So A is city, B is customer. So the inner join will be the data that is common to both tables. But I think we need to probably go a bit more in detail on this, because when we talk about the intersection, I mean, city has its own data and customer has its own data. But what you do have is there's a column in those two tables that are used to link the two tables, and then brings the data back where that link is matching. All right, so I'll go into a bit more detail on this. So it's not just simply an intersection as is normally represented for inner joins, but it is a link between two tables, and then we pull the data, those records, based on a particular column being the same in and linking the two tables. So normally you have the concept, you have a key, and you have a key in one table would be the same as the key in another table where it's called a foreign key. So just to go in a bit more in detail, we'll have the customer table. In this example, we'll have a key, a column called city ID, which is a foreign key into the city table. And the city table will have a column called ID, where the link is where the city ID matches the ID in this table, city. And then when those two columns match, when those two values match, then we pull that data back, and that is the middle data, the intersection that we have here. So it's not just that all the data, the same data in both, but it's actually a bit more specific than that, where we're joining on a column in both tables where the value matches and then the data links together. And commonly in the database world, the data is actually more information about the record. So for example, in the case of the customer, so the customer has a name and has an address, and the address has the city value. So in this case, the city details are not stored in the customer table, but it's stored in the city table. And then you'd have, using that foreign key link between the customer and the city, we pulled the data of the city. So in that respect, you get a more complete picture of the information about the customer by linking the two tables. And this is what the inner join accomplishes. Go a bit more, give you an example of what I was talking about. A lot of words there before what I was just talking about. So let's see now. We have two tables here. One table is called city, which is called, and you can see the data there, London, Reading, Bristol, with the IDs there. And then we have another table called customer, and that table has three records, and you have Sharif, you have John, you have Pat. You have the customer, you have the gender, and you have this city ID. So we had city, which had the ID of 1, 2, and 3, and now we have city ID in this table. And this city ID is a foreign key into the city table, where these IDs will match the ID in the other table, and then you get more information as to with respect to the city itself that the customer belongs to. And this is what we're going to use to join the two tables, as the word says, joining. So we're using this city table city ID column, sorry, we're using the city ID column to join with the city um, table on the ID itself. And this is how we will run a simple query here to show you how to run the inner join statement. So we'll say select star, select everything from customer, and we'll inner join on the city table, inner join with the city table, and we're joining on city ID is equal to customer.cityid. So the ID column on the city table with the city ID column on the customer table. And when we run this, you see now we get these results, and you can see now that we're getting 3 records back, and these are for the customers where the city ID matches the city ID on the customer table matches the ID on the city table. And you can see here now, you can see it's a combination of both. You can see Sharif Male London ID 1 and city ID is 1. John London ID 1, city ID is 1. Pat in Reading ID is 2 and city ID is 2. But just coming back to the table itself, you notice there was a third entry here, Bristol 3. And the reason it didn't come back is simply because there is no customer in the customer table where the city ID is 3. And since there's no customer with the city ID of 3, or no customer who lives in Bristol, correspondingly, this statement, this inner join statement, will not return that particular record. And this is where the concept of intersection. So we're getting the common data, and in this case we're getting all the data from both tables, where the link, the join, is on the ID in the city table matches the city ID in the customer table. And you get here we're getting all the data. Name and city ID and gender comes from the customer table, and name and ID comes from the city table. Of course, we can now, here we said select star. If you see here on this tool, SQL Developer, Oracle SQL Developer, you can expand this to say specifically what you're after, and you can also selectively choose what data you want to see from this table. So if I want just to see the name and the city, I could choose. Let's change this to be customer dot name and city dot name, and if we run this, we should get, here you go, we get John London, Sharif London, Pat in Reading. And like this, we can have the correct change the column names if you want by adding, I could put here cast name as an alias, and I can put city name here, and yeah, you can do lots of things, but the point I'm trying to demonstrate here is the inner join and the concept of intersection between the two tables, where we join on a particular column value. In this case, the ID on the city table matching the city ID in the customer table. And this goes into the concept of primary keys and foreign keys. Briefly, the ID in this is the primary key, so it's unique for the records in the city table. And because we're referring to that primary key in another table, the city ID is actually referring to the primary key in the city table. We call that a foreign key. So city ID in the customer table is a foreign key to the city table itself. Well, I hope this has been helpful. Just showing a bit around about inner joins, and next video I'll be looking at other